Welcome to this explainer. Troublemaker is a word we hear absolutely all the time. It gets tossed around as a casual insult on the playground or even in the office. But what if it's actually a highly calculated weapon of institutional control? Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating commentary by Denzo Kenobi titled The Troubler of Israel. This essay takes a totally impartial, highly analytical look at the anatomy of this specific word. It strips away the emotion to reveal how power structures use language to literally reverse a crime. We're going to trace this idea from ancient, dust-covered kingdoms all the way to modern federal filing cabinets. It's an incredible historical journey, so let's get into it.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the anatomy of a troublemaker, then look at 3 ancient case studies. From there, we'll map out the institutional pattern, dive into the historical playbook, and finally answer the big question, who actually caused the trouble?
Section 1. Anatomy of a troublemaker, reversing the crime.
If we examine this word not just as a reflex, but as a calculated institutional tool, it really becomes a masterclass in shifting focus. The crucial point here is a neat grammatical trick. By its plain definition, you'd think a troublemaker is someone who efficiently creates trouble, right? But in practice, it's almost always applied to the person who merely names the trouble that's already sitting right there in the room. This label takes a fact, the exposure of a disorder, and completely relocates the blame. It shifts it from the institution that actually produced the mess directly onto the person who just happened to notice it. And once everyone accepts this new label, well, the case is closed before it even opens. The institution doesn't have to answer for the crisis anymore. It only has to punish the noticing of it.
Moving right along to Section 2, 3 ancient case studies, the blueprints of crisis management.
To prove this isn't just some modern phenomenon, the author uses 3 biblical case studies as literal blueprints for blame shifting. We start with the prophet Elijah. The context here is a devastating 3-year famine. Now, according to the text, King Ahab provoked this famine himself through his own disastrous policies and idolatry. The trouble started at the top. But when Ahab finally confronts Elijah, he asks this, "Art thou he that troubleth Israel?" Ahab isn't genuinely asking if there is trouble. The mass starvation has already answered that. Instead, he's delivering a verdict that's wearing the grammar of a question. He is defining Elijah as the author of the drought, simply because Elijah called it out.
And this brilliantly sets up Elijah's rebuttal. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't deny that there's massive trouble. Instead, he accurately relocates the chain of causation right back to where it belongs, the throne. Elijah points out that it was the king and his father's house who broke the rules. By doing this, Elijah exposes the label for exactly what it is, just noise offered by a guilty party. The man being called the troubler is actually the only person in the room who didn't cause the trouble.
Next up, we look at Amos. He's an outsider who travels to a royal sanctuary to call out injustice and corruption. But the pushback here doesn't come directly from the king. It comes from Amaziah, a priest, and a classic institutional insider. Notice his exact complaint. Amaziah doesn't say Amos is lying. He doesn't even try to debate the theology. He simply says the land is not able to bear all his words. He's using the administrative language of security and capacity. It's basically the ancient equivalent of saying someone is disruptive to morale. He completely avoids the truth of the message by attacking the inconvenience of the messenger.
And right here, we see the exact mechanics of gatekeeping at play. Amaziah doesn't immediately resort to violence. Instead, he offers Amos a deal. Go, flee thee away, and there eat bread. It's the bargain of compliance. He is offering Amos material comfort, basically the ability to eat and survive, in exchange for his withdrawal and his silence. It's a classic move. An insider using their undisturbed position to try and make an inconvenience quietly go away, protecting the crown without the crown ever having to lift a finger.
In our third case, featuring Jeremiah, the situation really escalates. Jerusalem is starving under a Babylonian military siege. Jeremiah has been telling them the uncomfortable truth. They literally need to surrender to survive. Well, the princes of the city bring a charge against him, and the language they use is striking. They claim he weakeneth the hands of the men of war, and that he seeks the hurt of the people. They take a man who is telling the truth about a doomed policy and frame him as a physical threat to morale. The charge becomes physical, and Jeremiah is literally thrown into a mud-filled cistern. They leave him to die by neglect, so no single person has to take the direct blame for his murder.
That brings us to Section 3, the institutional pattern, a predictable architecture. If we pull back and synthesize those ancient stories from completely different centuries, we don't just see random events. Across all these accounts, a highly predictable four-step pattern of institutional self-preservation emerges. Step 1. The charge often arrives from an insider whose own comfort absolutely depends on the system remaining undisturbed. Step 2. The charge is never about truth or falsehood. It's framed in the language of order, capacity, and security. Step 3. A bargain of compliance is offered. Just withdraw and you'll be comfortable. And step 4, when rescue or vindication finally comes, it never comes from the insiders. It comes from an outsider with nothing to lose by telling the truth. Just like how an Ethiopian eunuch had to rescue Jeremiah from that muddy cistern.
Now, on to Section 4, the historical playbook, from ancient Near East to federal files.
Because this isn't just ancient history, right? The exact same administrative vocabulary migrated directly into modern federal filing cabinets. Let's look at the post-Civil War era, during Reconstruction. When formerly enslaved black men declined to accept highly exploitative labor contracts, Southern legislatures didn't argue the merits of those unfair contracts. Instead, they passed black codes that renamed the refusal a crime. By classifying those who refused as vagrants, they used a label to completely foreclose the argument. It's the exact same trick King Ahab used. Blame the man, not the terrible arrangement. They required written proof of employment and even authorized binding black children as apprentices against their parents' will. If you didn't comply, you weren't seen as a person exercising judgment. You were instantly labeled the source of the disorder.
Shifting into the 20th century, the playbook gets an actual filing system. The Church Committee's investigation into the FBI's COINTELPRO program revealed federal target lists for black activists and organizers. If we look at the headings on these files, the Agitator Index, the Rabble-Rouser Index, the Security Index, these headings are practically identical in spirit and function to the ancient institutional complaints we just analyzed from those biblical priests and princes.
To give you a stark, documented anchor for the sheer scale of this institutional response, consider this number, 379. Between 1967 and 1971, the Bureau contemplated 379 proposed actions against black nationalist groups and individuals. That is an immense systemic effort to manage those who are simply naming the troubles present in society.
When you compare the ancient and modern jargon, it draws a direct, unbroken line across thousands of years. On one side, you have Amaziah the ancient priest saying, "The land is not able to bear his words." On the other side, you have J. Edgar Hoover's 1967 directive to expose, disrupt, misdirect, neutralize civil rights leaders. To neutralize is literally just, the land is not able to bear wearing a modern federal badge. The vocabulary is strictly administrative, not moral. Why? Because whether the activists were right was never the question the institution wanted to adjudicate. They just wanted the inconvenience to stop.
Finally, Section 5. Who caused the trouble? The final verdict.
We've seen how the label is used, but what does it really mean when an institution calls someone a troublemaker? Well, the author of the essay observes a matched pair of indictments that occurs when someone advocates against a broken system. You basically face a double indictment. First, you are labeled a troublemaker by your own kind, the insider, the Amaziah figure who wants to protect their own undisturbed position and prove to the higher-ups that they can maintain order. Only second are you labeled by the external power structure itself, the Ahab figure, and they of course have a massive material interest in keeping the trouble's true origin unnamed.
And so, returning to Elijah's original, brilliant rebuttal, we see the absolute truth of the matter. I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house. Naming the trouble does not create it. Pointing out the drought, the bad labor contract, or the societal injustice doesn't manufacture those things out of thin air. It only makes it impossible for the actual authors of the trouble to keep pretending that the disaster has no address.
We'll wrap up this explainer by leaving you with a provocative thought to chew on. The next time you see someone being marginalized as a troublemaker for speaking up, ask yourself this. If you name the trouble, does that make you the author of it? Or is the label troublemaker actually an admission of guilt by the establishment itself? Thank you so much for joining us, and keep asking the right questions.